thank you to Dr. Helmy for the invitation to speak to you this evening on behalf of Amnesty International. The key thing, I suppose, the key message of my address this evening can be summed up as follows, and that is that there is no justice in this country anymore. And that's a phrase that Amnesty International has heard over and over again in the last number of months in Egypt. We've heard it from the family of a man sentenced to death after an unfair trial, and from the father of a teenage protester shot dead in the streets. There is no justice in Egypt. And if I'm going to talk about Egypt this evening, really that's where I want to start, and that's the main message that I want to emphasise. And it's a very sad, depressing message, but it's important to recognise the reality of it. The institutions meant to deliver fair and even-handed justice, to uphold the rule of law and to protect human rights, have instead become parts of a state machine designed to crush dissent. The laws restrict fundamental freedoms, the police use deadly force against peaceful protesters, the courts convict critics of government. Almost a year ago, the authorities said they had a roadmap to democracy. Today, sadly, it looks much more like a roadmap to repression. I repeat, there is no justice in Egypt anymore. This evening, I want to give a brief overview of what Amnesty International sees as the main human rights concerns and the patterns of human rights abuse that we have identified. The first is excessive force by security forces. Time and again, we've seen protesters met with a hail of bullets and tear gas, with batons, water cannons and armoured vehicles. Ordinary men and women protesting for their civil and political rights have been met by riot police and black-masked special forces. Since the 3rd of July last year, over 1,400 people have died in political violence, many at the hands of the security forces, and others while the police stood idly by while violence raged in the streets. Where some protesters have used violence, the police have responded to almost all with unnecessary, excessive and lethal force. The deadliest day in Egypt's modern history was on the 14th of August last year. That day, security forces killed at least 600 people gathered in Rabah al-Adawiba Square and al-Nada Squares in Cairo. 8 members of the security forces also died in the violence. Hundreds more people died across the country that day in protests and political violence, as well as 64 members of the security forces. Our researchers visited Rabah al-Adawiya the day after. They saw the burned out remains of the sit-in and the nearby mosque, and they spoke to forensic officials and grieving families at the morgue. One of the protesters told Amnesty International, "People were dying all around me. One nurse that we spoke to told us there were so many cases of both killed and injured that we lost count." Torture and ill-treatment were the scourge of Hosni Mubarak's rule. Today, these practices still remain rife in prisons, police stations, and military camps. Former detainees have told us of severe beatings at the hands of the security forces as part of so-called welcoming parties. Some have said they were also subjected to electric shocks or held in contorted or painful positions. One protester told us that the walls of their cell were smeared with blood. Those are just the abuses that we've been able to document, but the truth is, torture happens in the shadows. And recently we have learned that some people are simply disappearing. We found evidence that dozens of civilians have been held for months in secret detention at an Egyptian military camp. There, they're being subjected to torture and other ill-treatment to make them confess to crimes. A former detainee held there told us, "They blindfolded me, handcuffed me from behind and took off my clothes. Then they gave me electric shocks all over my body, including in my testicles." The security forces have led a sweeping crackdown on individuals perceived to be supporters of Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. Many of those arrested do not face any formal charges. Instead, they languish in detention for months on end while the prosecution continues its investigation. Many say their rights have been flouted in detention. Detainees can't contact their families or their lawyers, leaving their loved ones to desperately search police stations and prosecution offices. Lawyers are not given notice of interrogation times, and in some cases are barred from even seeing their clients. Estimates of the numbers of detained vary, but it is likely to reach into the thousands. What is clear is that the crackdown is all-encompassing and ongoing. If the presidential palace on the 3rd of July last year was the centre, in the months since his ousting, it's reached out into the streets of Cairo, Alexandria, and Upper Egypt and the villages, towns, and into homes where families now sleep, fearing the knock on the door in the dead of night, into university dormitories, and even into schoolrooms. It's everywhere, and it's everyone. Public enemy number one, of course, is Mohammed Morsi himself, who is now facing at least 3 separate criminal trials. After his arrest, he and his aides were held in conditions amounting to enforced disappearance for months on end. One of his aides, Khaled Al-Kazaz, still doesn't face, as far as we know, a single criminal charge, but is indeed still held in a maximum security prison. But the crackdown also includes students and school children, kids like high school student Khaled Mohammed Bakara, arrested on the 25th of November after his teachers called the police after seeing him using stationery that had symbols on it used by supporters of Mohammed Morsi. It's not just the Muslim Brotherhood anymore. In the last few months, the circle of repression has widened to encompass anyone who has dared to criticise the government. Freedom of expression is being stifled. In the last year, journalists and other media workers have faced harassment and arrest. The authorities have shut down television stations known for their support of the Muslim Brotherhood or Mohammed Morsi. Some journalists have even faced military trials for exposing army abuses in the Sinai or leaking government documents. Those targeted, as we well know, include the Al Jazeera English journalists found guilty and sentenced this week in Cairo on charges of broadcasting false news and involvement with the Muslim Brotherhood. But these journalists' real crime is challenging the authorities' political narrative. The space for independent civil society is also shrinking. The authorities have continued to suppress the work of human rights organisations. The government places unreasonable protections or unreasonable restrictions on the registration, funding and activities of civil society groups. The authorities have also cracked down on mass activist movements that led the charge against Hosni Mubarak back in January of 2011. A couple of months ago, the security forces raided the Egyptian Centre for Economic and Social Rights in Alexandria, arresting its staff and volunteers. It was the second raid on the centre within 6 months. One of the centre's lawyers told Amnesty International that security forces chased them down the stairs and into side streets, beating their staff with their hands and gun butts. In April, a court banned the April 6th youth movement, the grassroots movement that had led many of the mass protests during the 2011 uprising. 2 of the group's leaders are now in jail for protesting unlawfully. The authorities have also dealt a deadly blow to the right to peaceful assembly. In November, the President signed a new law on protests. It gives the Interior Ministry sweeping powers over demonstrations and forces protest organisers to inform the authorities before staging any demonstrations. Since the law came into force, the security forces have used it against both pro-Morsi supporters and their political opponents. These include people like human rights lawyer and activist Mahinur El-Masri, who was jailed a month or so back when a court in Alexandria convicted her of staging an unauthorised protest. She had gone to the protest to call for justice for Khaled Saeed, a young man killed by police in June 2010, whose death in turn helped to fuel the public anger that sparked the 2011 uprising. Egypt's judiciary seems more concerned with locking up Mohamed Morsi's supporters and government critics than it does with holding the security forces accountable for gross human rights violations. In fact, it seems determined to finish in the courts what the security forces have begun in the streets. That's led to grossly unfair trials. In the last few months, we've seen courts hand down the largest number of death sentences in living memory, not just in Egypt, but in the world. On the 20th of April, a court in Minya sentenced 37 people to death and 491 others to life in prison. Just a few weeks earlier, it had been prepared to sentence all 528 to death. Amnesty's trial observer was there to see the judge urge the prosecution to challenge his own verdict and to go for hanging again. The same day, the same court agreed to sentence a further 683 people to death following a litany of violations of due process. So let's get one thing straight. This wasn't the work of a rogue judge. This is the sign of an entire criminal justice system veering wildly out of control. Prosecutors have sent cases to court with hundreds of defendants, all facing the same set of charges from murder to blocking the traffic, with little or no evidence of individual criminal responsibility. Amnesty's trial observer in Minya saw a court empty of defendants, but full of armed police. Outside, he saw the families whose lives had been laid waste by the verdicts. One person fainted at hearing the news. One of the relatives told him, "Welcome to the village of death penalties." Selective justice will not break the cycle of abuse, nor will it restore faith in Egypt's criminal justice system. What's needed now more than ever is a fair and even-handed system, one with the power to hold both security forces accountable for human rights violations and to bring to justice those responsible for political violence, whatever their political affiliation. In January of this year, the authorities adopted a new constitution, one which they said better protected the rights of women and of minorities. But the truth is, amidst the political turmoil, women and Coptic Christians have faced a rising tide of violence and continued discrimination. Women protesters participating in demonstrations around Tahrir Square have faced a wave of sexual violence. There were over 100 attacks around Tahrir Square reported in the week of 30th June alone. Despite the level of violence and the fact that attacks regularly take place during protests, the authorities have taken little action to stop or investigate them or to bring those responsible to justice. Women continue to face discrimination in law and in practice. Research gathered by Amnesty International in the past year suggests that while men languish in political jails, untold women may also be trapped in loveless, abusive marriages. The law compels wives to obey their husbands but leaves them little recourse for justice. The police seem more concerned with stamping out political dissent than catching rapists or abusive spouses. One woman told Amnesty, "The police do not care if a man beats his wife." Discrimination also affects Coptic Christians, a community which faced an unprecedented level of violence after the Rabat al-Adawiya dispersal. Sectarian attacks left 4 dead, 43 churches damaged, and 200 Christian businesses and homes damaged. The Egyptian authorities said the attacks were terrorism, yet failed to properly investigate them, or the security forces' failure to prevent and stop the violence. A mob killed Coptic Christian Iskandar Tous in his home on the 14th of August last year. The men mutilated his body and dragged it through the streets with a tractor. He was 60 years old and a father of 9. After his family buried him, his body was dug out of his grave on 2 occasions. The authorities have promised stability, but instead we have seen human rights abuses and rising political violence. The security situation has deteriorated, with army checkpoints, security personnel and government buildings all coming under increased attacks. While the violence has mostly affected North Sinai, it has increasingly spread to other regions. Amnesty International condemns human rights abuses, regardless of the perpetrators. We categorically denounce indiscriminate attacks and attacks targeting civilians by armed groups. No cause can ever justify such attacks. However, we are concerned that the authorities are using the deteriorating security situation as a pretext to repress all forms of opposition, including those who use lawful and peaceful means of protest. That includes the use of new counter-terrorism legislation approved by the government, which, if fully rolled out, would further restrict freedoms of expression, association and assembly, and erode fair trial safeguards. In practice, the authorities are likely to use any new counter-terrorism powers to crack down on the Muslim Brotherhood and other political opponents. The Egyptian government has the right and the duty to protect lives and prosecute those responsible for crimes, but they must not sacrifice human rights in the name of countering terrorism. I want to say a word about the international community, because we're sitting here a long way from Egypt, in a country that potentially could have influence for the better. Egypt is facing a human rights crisis, but the international community has failed to respond with the measures needed to address it. The truth is, most countries seem to just want to go back to business as normal. The US authorities cannot condemn lethal force against protesters on the one hand, while on the other resume military aid to the Egyptian authorities to the tune of some $575 million, which has happened just in the last week with John Kerry's visit to Cairo. The European Union has said that it will stop sending arms and equipment that fuel internal repression, but European states make ready, we know, to flout the ban. They instead must hold the line. And it's time to end the mixed signals and the double standards. And it's also time for the United Nations human rights body to take the lead. If Egypt's authorities are unwilling or unable to deliver truth and justice, then the Human Rights Council should explore other mechanisms to deliver accountability. So what of the future? Because it's a gloomy picture I've had to outline so far, and I apologise for that, but again, the truth shouldn't be hidden from, and that's why we're here this evening. Egypt went to the polls at the end of May. By his own admission, the successful candidate had nothing to offer, no vision for human rights or rule of law, and very little hope for the future. Instead, what he offered, and all he seems still to offer, is an uncompromising crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood, the same as Mubarak did 3.5 years ago. But this isn't square one. Too many people have died, too many more are languishing in prison, and too many are still living in grinding poverty. The government estimates that some 25% of Egyptians still live below the national poverty line, and over 12 million people live in informal settlements, half of them in the Greater Cairo area. For decades, these were the people that no one spoke for, but in January 2011, it was these people who spoke for themselves, who took to the streets calling for bread, for freedom and for social justice. Many of those killed in the uprising were from Egypt's slums and poorest areas, shot down outside police stations that for decades had served to keep them down rather than serve their needs. Sadly, it looks like the government's big plan for poverty is just to move it, to relocate the poor out of the big cities and to put them into places where no one can see them, to make way for industry and big business. That seems to be the big idea for addressing poverty. We're not in a position to sit here and to predict the future, but one thing we do know, and one thing that I want to leave you with, the authorities want to take Egypt back into the past, to the long dark decades of repression from which people have been trying to emerge. One student that Amnesty International spoke to summed it up. When he was arrested, a state security officer told him, "You will never see your mother or the sun again. You will be underground for 20 years. And that's what the authorities want to do, it seems. But then at last, I'm also reminded of another activist, a man blinded by police gunfire, but who never stopped protesting. And this is what he said to Amnesty International. He said, "What happened through this revolution is that the fear barrier was removed. Fear does not exist anymore. People want to live in dignity, and we will not stop."